want to talk to you about Econsult's report that they gave you. I reviewed Econsult's report, and I don't believe that they delivered what they promised you. Here are 3 areas where I believe they missed the mark. First, Newtown Township was supposed to receive from Econsult 6 different reports. They are listed on page 18 of their technical proposal, and some were due to you from 1 to 4 months prior to the final report. In fact, Econsult was supposed to use their first 5 reports as a guide to create the final report. I submitted a right to know request to the township, and I was told that these first 5 reports don't exist. Here's an example of how that may have hurt you. In their final report, there's a really good analysis of police compensatory time and overtime. Econsult wants you to lower police overtime by 30% by 2023, and that's in their recommended scenario 3. But the problem is you just signed a new contract through 2023, and maybe if you had received this information in one of the earlier reports that you were promised, you could have taken this up in the current contract you just signed. Second, the public was supposed to get a chance to comment on Econsult's findings before the final report was issued. There is an in-depth discussion on page 4 of their technical proposal of what this public meeting was supposed to be about. As far as I know, that meeting never happened. At the August 26th meeting of this board, Stephen Ray of Econsult referred to what I believe was the public survey meeting as this review meeting. And I submitted a comment to the board at your last meeting asking you to correct the minutes of August 26th that there was no public meeting. Third, the final report does not appear to contain a scope of work that I believe is expected under the STMP Strategic Management Planning Program and for which you received the grant. I expected to see recommendations along the lines of the report that Econsult prepared for the borough of Pottstown. Econsult included the Pottstown report in their technical proposal to you as an example. And according to Econsult, an STMP report is supposed to help you implement 5 budget measures. I want to talk about each measure and give you some suggestions. The first measure is cost containment. Your baseline forecast shows that general operating expenses will grow to be 20% higher in 5 years, from $12.3 million in 2020 to $14.6 million in 2025. An increase of $2.3 million per year by 2025. Econsult does not tackle this increase with cost containment measures. For the borough of Pottstown, on the other hand, Econsult proposed $1 million per year in expense cuts. The second measure is adoption of best management practices to achieve operating efficiencies. But this is what Econsult says in their summary of recommendations, which is section 12.5 about efficiencies. It's a major expenditure recommendations pertain to improving efficiency by way of increasing personnel. In other words, instead of spending 20% more in 5 years, they are recommending you hire 10 more employees and spend 30% more in 5 years. So their way of having you deal with spending $14.6 million by 2025 from an efficiency perspective is to spend $15.9 million instead. Econsult highlighted an operating efficiency measure in their discussion of the staffing of the police department. They just didn't propose that you do anything about it. Econsult said that Chief Hearn's analysis shows that we need 12 more officers. And if you think about the impact of the jointure, I can understand that. The jointure steers to you all the commercial development that the other townships do not want, all of which require emergency services. You get more restaurants, which have fire risk. You get establishments serving alcohol, which have DUI risk, and retail, which is petty theft risk. Upper Makefield and Wrightstown preserve their rural makeup without those risks and without those costs. The problem is we can't afford 12 officers, so the forecast only includes 3. Now, in terms of staffing, and this is the operating deficiency issue, Econsult refers to an ideal police staffing ratio of 1 supervisor for every 6 officers. Out of a department of 29, which we now have 13 officers with a rank of corporal or above, excluding the chief. If we hire 12 more officers for a complement of 41, then we'd be in a 3-to-1 ratio. But if we only hire 3 officers, then with a complement of 32, operating efficiency calls for less supervisors and more regular patrol officers. After discussing all this in the report, Econsult chose not to address it. So So does that mean the solution is to live with supervisors performing regular patrol officer duties? The third measure that Econsult was supposed to help you with is revenue enhancement. Econsult's version of revenue enhancement is for you to raise the millage rate from 4.5 to 11.75 mils. And to put this in context, the millage rate in 2016, when Delancey Court, where I live, was built, was 2.5 mils. So Econsult wants you to impose a millage rate that is almost 5 times higher than when Delancey Court residents moved in. I would argue that raising the millage rate is not what's meant by revenue enhancement. Instead, I would point you to section 4.4 of the report, where they have a recommendation they label ADM 01. Econsult recommends you hire a full-time code enforcement officer. And Econsult also recommended you increase zoning and permit fee collections so the position becomes self-sustaining over 3 years. But then they say in a footnote, the revenues generated from hiring a new code enforcement officer were not included in future revenues to remain conservative in our analysis. That's ridiculous. If you believe in the revenues, then you include in the forecast and hold someone accountable. If you don't believe in the revenues, then you don't fill the position. And while we were talking about the code enforcement officer, other townships use this as a split position. Both Wrightstown and Doylestown have a split fire marshal code enforcement officer. But if you still want a full-time code enforcement officer for $60,000 to $80,000 per year and are not willing to include the offsetting revenues in the forecast, I'll point out that you have 2 administrative assistants in that department whose salaries are already in that range. Either train one to be the code enforcement officer or remove one of the positions. And perhaps Mr. Lewis can take a second administrative assistant in lieu of hiring an assistant township manager. The fourth measure is the implementation of long-term economic development strategies. A lot of these ideas were already suggested by the Finance Committee. What's missing from the forecast is how much money you are willing to expend to accomplish these strategies. Hiring an assistant township manager is not enough. You need to hire experts, consultants who can find an employer to occupy the former offices of Lockheed Martin, or who could develop a business commons into a mixed-use property, and that takes real money. And if you're not willing to spend that money, keep in mind that Econsult Scenario 3 has you returning to deficit spending by 2024 and falling below your reserve threshold by 2025. So you better plan for 3 years of expenditures to implement these long-term strategies by 2024. Perhaps maybe you can get grant money to pay for these consultants. And that brings me to another thing. The other consultant you need is a certified grant writer. This person can pursue your money for long-term projects, as well as pursue other grant money that the other townships in Bucks County seem to be getting. The fifth measure is the pursuit of intergovernmental cost-sharing strategies. One thing that Econsult did not mention is that you have a 10-year contract for police services for Wrightstown that was entered into in 2012, and it's expiring in 2022. Wrightstown may have 1/6 the population and 1/5 the police response calls, but its square mileage to patrol is about the same as Newtown. And in my view, you should be getting twice as much as what you charge Wrightstown right now. If the police department needs more officers, then negotiate a new contract with Wrightstown to pay for them. And in my view also, the jointure itself should be contributing to police officer funding, given that they're sending all the commercial development to you. So what went awry? Maybe before COVID-19, everyone thought a tax increase would be enough. We also know the Econsult manager left in the middle of the engagement, so maybe their analysis just didn't get flushed out. I believe it will be more difficult to manage all that has to be done without some of the separate reports that you were promised. Lastly, I want to talk about the fire department. I had a Facebook chat with the Volunteer Fire Association, and they say they're having trouble covering weekends. With or without the SAFER grant, you should be hiring 2 or 3 more career firefighters so you can reallocate scheduling to cover weekends. If you do not get the SAFER grant, you should press Newtown Borough to pay for these firefighters. I also believe for the same reason that the jointure should be covering to our police coverage, they should be covering to our fire coverage because of the commercial development we're taking from the jointure. If you do get the SAFER grant, I understand that the plan is to hire a deputy fire chief. I don't think you can afford this position based on your long-term forecast, and I say that because I think I've already said I don't think you can afford a fire chief. But I'd rather see you hire only 3 firefighters and spend $100,000 per year as incentives toward retention of volunteer firefighters, similar to what's done at Northampton Township. And also maybe you can get a grant for that. But if you do decide that the organizational structure calls for both a career fire chief and a career deputy chief, just bear in mind that these two career positions will cost you over $1 million in the next 5 years. One thing going in your favor, I also think the 5-year baseline forecast that Econsult gave you, it strikes me as too conservative. Historically, expenditures have been under budget, and EIT revenues so far in 2020 are looking good. But with COVID-19 still affecting the township and all the uncertainty around the EIT, I would urge as much belt tightening as you can tolerate. And a tax increase will be a lot more palatable for residents if you're seen as doing your part to keep expenses under control. Every department head should be pursuing revenue and cost-saving strategies. If the ideas I mentioned are not worthwhile, then negotiate amongst yourselves and prioritize your spending needs. Thank you.